Okay, so sit there while yeah. Okay, so we're going to get started. It's 4:10, actually 4:11. So welcome to the fifth event in the Sawyer Seminar Series. It's the fifth already. We're approaching the end and we all feel very sad. Today our speakers are Helen Verran, Judith Farquhar, and Tsing. Helen is in charge of the main presentation, the title of which is Carrying the Dead Along Towards Ontologically Canny Politics. And Anna and Judy will converse with Helen's presentation. Helen has had a wonderfully unusual academic trajectory. Trained as a scientist, she has taught the history and philosophy of science for 25 years at Melbourne University. She has also taught science education at the University of Ife at Ile-Ife, Oyo State, Nigeria, where she also learned from school teachers the local practices of numbers. And I think that it might have been with this teacher where Helen self-taught the ethnographic philosophy that she deploys to write when she talks about numbers, databases, digital media, property titles as they take place across heterogeneous forms of knowledge encounters. Characteristically interdisciplinary, Helen works collaboratively with academic and non-academic intellectuals, linguists, biologists, and sociologists. Her first book, Science and an African Logic, won the Ludwig Fleck Prize awarded by the 4S and was commended for the Herskovits Prize by the African Studies Association. The title of her new book is Nature and the Market, Ontological Interventions. It will be published next year by the MIT Press. Judy Farquhar currently teaches at the University of Chicago. She is an anthropologist whose background is also interdisciplinary. Judy was trained in Chinese medicine, and before becoming a professional anthropologist, she worked at the National Institute of Neurological and Communicative Disorders and Stroke, a branch of the NIH. Judy writes about Chinese medicine, connecting it with equal ease to classical texts and to the mundane and everyday. She also has a talent to work in translation, and in so doing, blurred dichotomies ethnographically. She demonstrated these already in her first book, Knowing Practice, The Clinical Encounter of Chinese Medicine. Appetites is the title of her second book, and in it, Judy blends literary analysis and ethnography to write about sensuality and pleasure in post-Maoist China, weaving historical connections across Chinese medicine, food, movies, art, and sex. And then there's 10,000 Things, Nurturing Life in Contemporary Beijing, her third book, written with Qicheng Zhang, a Chinese historical philologist. Together, they co-labor a cosmopolitan translation, carefully considering how to best move the phrases, concepts, and practices across their fields of life and expertise. Her current work is on state-led practices of knowledge production about the traditional medicines of China's national minorities. This is also collaborative work with Lai Lili, a Chinese anthropologist. And then we have Anna Tsing, a familiar face at UC Davis. She teaches at neighboring UC Santa Cruz. She has also taught at the University of Chicago, Harvard, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and at the University of Aarhus in Copenhagen, where she currently directs the program Living in the Anthropocene, Discovering the Potential of Unintended Design on Anthropogenic Landscapes. Today, I want to call Anna an ethnographer of rainforests. In the realm of the Diamond Queen, Anna's first book, which counts among the best contemporary ethnographic writers, she straddled anthropology and cultural studies and was informed by stories that she collected in the rainforests of Kalimantan, Indonesia. In her second book, Friction, these rainforests were the main character. They traveled with Anna to conferences and other events around the world, and Anna traveled with them. Finally, and although not Kalimantan or Indonesia, rainforests are still a source of conceptual inspiration in Anna's current work, Matsutake Worlds. This is a multiple person collaboration involving social scientists in the US and Canada. Following Matsutake across human and other than human forests and market ecologies in China, Japan, and the US, these mushrooms and all they that gathers around them tell stories about worldwide commodity chains. The Matsutake group tell these stories using different media, the internet, videos, and the more usual articles and books. The title of Helen's talk today, Carrying the Dead Along Towards Ontologically Canny Politics, is what we will hear first. Then Anna and Judy, in an order that they will decide, will converse with it, and then we'll open the conversation to us. Let's welcome Helen, Anna, and Judy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to this talk this afternoon. Thank you also to the Sawyer Foundation for funding this wonderful series of seminars. Thank you to Davis for supporting the seminars, particularly the anthropology and STS groups. And thanks most of all to Marisol and Mario for their work, their creative work in imagining the series, their communicative work in being on such good terms with all those interesting people that they come here to talk to you, and the bodily work of keeping it all together. So thank you. My title, Carrying the Dead Along, should be understood as a refrain. It's a refrain that interrupts, it makes something perceptible that we might otherwise miss, and at the core of this talk is the story of how this refrain came to mean something for me. Ontic politics, which is the shorter version of Towards Canny Ontological Politics, is that what it was? Yes. Ontic politics, it's an analytic concept. I'll talk about that in beginning, so don't panic if you think it's totally opaque. It's totally opaque to most people in the world. That's fine. I'll talk about it before I really get going with my stories. But the images in my title slide also do work. They remind us of two things in particular, that the stories I'll tell come from a particular time and place, which is northeast Arnhem Land in Australia, and they also remind us of the particular socio-materialities, because ontics and ontic politics cannot be conceived of, cannot be done without particular material socialities. Okay, so what we see here is two images of a particular ceremony at what is called the Gama ceremony, or the Gama festival. It used to be held for about 10 years, it was held annually, and over 1,000 Australians used to gather there. Almost many Yolngu Aboriginal people would come to this ceremony, many Aboriginal people from many other parts of the world, and many white Australians as well. So there were always multiple political agendas being worked at this Gama ceremony. In the lower slide you see a women's dance, and there you see the materiality of the ceremony ground. The upper slide is a men's dance, and you see the materialities of the bodies that do this work. And most certainly in those performances, the dead are being carried along. So those images help me conjure up the socio-materialities of what we're doing here in this epistemic and political work that we do by gathering here in this very square cubic seminar room at Davis. And I don't know if any of you have looked at the videos of the previous speakers, and there's a wonderful socio-material interrupter that appears very strategically in all these videos. So I just want to point out my co-participator here, and it's this image. 2401A storage. Now, it's a prominent performer in all those other videos, and it will be in this. So we must recognise its presence here. It's always about brain level. But what does this interrupter, this socio-material interrupter, do for us? It reminds us of the vast socio-material network that is inside this gathering here together, where we're doing political and epistemic work. And 2401A storage is part of that. It means something to someone somewhere, so I honour it. Okay, so the stories that I'm going to tell are from Northeast Arnhem Land in Australia, and they arise in the collective life of people who call themselves Yolngu Aboriginal Australians. And I'm going to be talking about the ontic, or doing ontics, with my friends in Northeast Arnhem Land. Now, ontics and ontic politics will be totally opaque to almost everybody in the room, I should think. So I'm going to do a little diversion into philosophy first, just to make you a little familiar with ontics. Now, I stumbled across this domain that I call ontics, or doing ontics, when I was working in Nigerian classrooms. One project, I was in Nigeria for a little over 8 years, and one of the projects I undertook while I was there was speaking to many, many children on a one-to-one basis about the learning they were doing about numbers. Now, the children who were particularly interesting were those who were deeply bilingual. And ontics came into view by taking seriously what these bilingual children were telling me about numbers. And I talk about this in my book, Science and an African Logic. There were two profound surprises. First of all, that the core conceptual constructs involved in using Yoruba numbers were profoundly different to the conceptual constructs involved in using numbers in English and in science. I was in Nigeria as a science lecturer, and I kept coming across these incomprehensible numbers in classrooms. Second, I discovered that deeply bilingual children can talk about the differences between Yoruba number and number in English, and quite a few of them can also talk about the strategies that they use to manage the non-coherences between these incommensurable cognitive constructs. And so it was taking these children seriously, struggling to help me as they put into words what it is they did when they saw the differences between using numbers in classrooms in English and using numbers in Yoruba in marketplaces, that had me taking seriously something that I, up to that point, did not know existed, because I'd followed Kant in his compromise with empiricism. So the Kantian compromise assumes the existence of a given noumena. This is the word that Kant uses. Necessary things that are thought is a way we might paraphrase noumena. And some philosophers call this noumena, these necessary things that are thought, the ontic. And for these philosophers, and there are a few talking about the ontic across the 20th century, the ontic is static, stable and given. And ontology is, ology means study of, ontology is the study of this static, stable, given noumena. Now, the way I use ontics could not be further from the way all those eminent and wonderful philosophers use ontics. I do not use it in that way. I'm following Whitehead, who, if you think of the move that Whitehead, also a 20th century philosopher, made, what other people saw from a bird's eye view, Whitehead sees on the side. So he removes himself from the bird's eye view and looks sideways. So he's always seeing events distributed across all times and places. Okay, so doing ontics for me is very different to the way ontics is used in the philosophical literature. Mine is not a quest to describe how things really are. For me, ontics recognises itself as emergent with the world, or with worlds as emergent. Partial and performative. It does not aspire to completeness. It values and accepts vagueness. Now, ontics is in fact a politics. And it's a politics that I think, to do in good faith, we must struggle to make our metaphysical commitments visible and accessible, okay? And we often do this by telling stories. So I'm not going to launch into an account of my metaphysical commitments. They're minimalist, and you will be able to discern them. Doing ontics is always straining towards doing ontology. As soon as you start talking about it, you've more or less stopped doing ontics and begun to do ontology. In ontological politics, so ontics is a form of politics, but I think ontological politics is different. That's where we talk about what we're doing, when we negotiate what we're doing, and how they connect and separate. So ontological politics is different from ontic politics. And it's about realness. What it comes down to is different stories of what the real is. The real is not given, it's achieved and it's emergent, and it gradually clots around us, clots and unclots as we go along. And it's about the routinized, banal sets of practices by which we do the entities that we live with. Some of these entities we think of as subjects, other people. Some of these entities we think of as objects. But they're all lively entities enacted in collective process. So this notion of collective processes in which my co-performer, 2401A Storage, features also is making the reality of this time and place. Okay, sometimes, like numbers, we're so familiar with the routines, we forget. and we call them abstract, and we think they're given in the nature of the world. But we do numbers as much as we do ourselves as people. Okay, so for me, numbers are active entities. They're socio-material entities, much like the socio-material entities of the dead of Gangan, who you will meet later on in this story. Okay, so paying attention to socio-materialities is crucial to doing ontics. Being on the lookout for helpful interrupters is also really useful in doing ontics. Okay, so I'm going to start by playing a short extract of a video. When I first started working in Northeast Arnhem Land a little over 25 years ago, this was the first instruction I received, and it was instruction about the Ngatu ceremony. So I have a short video, it's about 3 minutes long, but I actually don't have it connected to the slide, so I'm going to exit that and no.
Is the ceremonial preparation of sign language, mouthful.
So I should have explained a little more. I was getting anxious about my co-presenter here. This ceremony was, and I'm sorry, the quality of the video is not great, but you will get the sense of it. This was presented to me as an allegory for what I would later call ontics or ontic politics. We had set about, or we were given the task by the community to devise a radical new curriculum for the school, which drew from both Aboriginal logic and Western logic. This is the 90s, when such things were possible in Australia. They're not possible now. And so I was presented with this allegory. Okay, what you need to do is this. Okay, so just for a moment, imagine that you're in the field, you're part of, you're receiving instruction. It's not entirely evident what it is you're meant to take away from this. Okay, so this is children receiving instruction in this allegory. It's a workshop. This is the food for the workshop.
On the left-hand side of the painting are the groups of ancestors collecting the cycad nuts. On the upper right, people are carrying bark on their heads to wrap the dough for the cycad bread. Below that is a roll of bundles already wrapped, perhaps already cooked. At the bottom of the centre panel, people are sitting down together to share bread according to law. Western eyes pick out these story pictures, but the formal patterns around them are elusive and hidden.
Okay, I'm very pleased to be able to have this allegory introduced by the people who own it. I don't own it. It's been given to me to use, partly because I was at that workshop, and partly because it's been given to me to use, partly because in the hope that you will learn from it. So I've been enfranchised, you might say, to use the Ngatu allegory. But of course I must start with those who own the allegory. The allegory tells us that that we must bring material from many places. So it's empirical. So this is a very short summary of what I think is in that allegory. That the bags of nuts come from many places. They come with many properties. They have their own story. But cycad nuts contain within them cyanide. So the seeds cannot be transformed into food very easily. So many steps must be undertaken, and in those steps, those many bags of nuts, those singular entities that are carried here to a particular place are transformed. And so they're made into a pile, and that pile becomes a whole. And then, importantly, that whole, that flesh that's inside the nuts, must be everted. Things that are inside must be brought to the outside. And only once that eversion, an unusual English word, eversion, only once that eversion has occurred can then that whole be repartitioned. Now for me that double step is what I call, that's a full form of generalizing. This is a form, it's a theory about empiricism that's embedded in that allegory. It's generalizing, but crucially with that evertive twist in the middle, whereby ones become a many, becomes a whole one, becomes a many again. Okay, so it's this allegory that I think can be used to as a form of, in understanding the form of ontic politics, in understanding the ontology that is in political events, is another way to think about it. Okay, so what I'm going to I'm going to talk about 3 episodes of ontic politics, and I want you to keep that form in your mind when you think about these. Now, I'm going to go quite quickly through these. The first one is a clearly political event. The proliferating bark petitions in the Australian polity. Yolngu bark petitions, if you go to the Australian capital and find the Australian Parliament building and walk into the Grand Hall, one of the first things you'll see is the first bark petition, the bark petition that was presented to the Australian Parliament in 1963 and from which many political changes have followed. Incidentally, not of course the political changes that were demanded in the petition, but political reforms nevertheless. Now these bark petitions are very unlikely documents to have at the core of a nation's polity. For one thing, they involve completely incommensurable linguistic conventions. In the middle you have English, written in the 1963 petition on a typewriter that a mission had abandoned, had been been given to one of the clanspeople who had discovered, because miners were crawling all over his land, and as the miners arrived, he discovered that he didn't own his land, or his clan did not own the land. It was a terrible shock. The first petition arose out of that Yolngu shock. There was a second in 1988, which marked the 1988 bicentenary of the British claiming sovereignty over the continent of what would become Australia. So 1988 was a particular political moment in Australia, and a second bark petition was presented and promoted the political context in which the Gama curriculum that I'll talk about in a moment becomes feasible. Now, the bark petitions sit there in Parliament House, and they remind all Australians of the pure unlikeliness of the Australian polity, built around incommensurability. It reminds us of the role of language in politics. It presents us again and again with the ahistorical in the history of the nation. I don't have time to say much more, but those bark petitions speak of an ontic politics that is straining and becoming an ontological politics. As I mentioned, the second, I didn't mention the third one, I should go back. The third one was in 2008, and it was produced in response to the recognition that what neoliberalism has brought to Australia is a new ontological situation. We have a new ontics. And so the third bark petition recognised, okay, you keep changing the ontology by which you do your nation, we still want to connect. We still want to find connections. So in a way, these proliferating bark petitions, they record what the Yolngu feel as the changing ontological conditions in the Australian polity. Okay, the second one is the moment, creates the moment within which this Gama curriculum becomes possible. 1988, there were moves for reconciliation that were, this is when moves for reconciliation were strongest in Australia in 1988. The 200 years, there's something about centenaries that do something to Western polities that bring about these moments. So it looks like we'll have to wait until, for quite a long while, for the next one. I was fortunate to arrive back in Australia after my years in Nigeria, just at the end of in 1988. And so I found myself at a moment in schools, in Aboriginal communities, where resources were being given for really radical curricula that would take knowledge traditions from both sides. And this was a movement that was very strongly directed by the elders of Aboriginal communities, who were convinced that young Aboriginal children should become modern Yolngu Australians, and to do that you needed modern Yolngu schools, and to do that you needed a Gama curriculum. Gama means a meeting place. Okay, so another short video.
One of their songs describes the landscape around here as it was during the last ice age. Over recent years, the Yolngu people have been developing a maths education program called Gama Maths. Gama means a meeting place, an open forum. Formal logical concepts embedded in Yolngu thought are the bedrock of the program. The homeland centres throughout Yolngu land take part. Bachelor College Teacher Training Program and the University of Melbourne Department of History and Philosophy of Science are active participants. Yirrkala Community School is the focus of the program. Yolngu land is in Australia, in the Northern Territory, at the northeast tip of Arnhem Land. The 4 living maths videos are about fundamental approaches to maths. The first 2 are about space, especially ways of locating in space. Videos 3 and 4 are about recursion. Video 1 is about Jalkari. Video 2 about the space grid. Video 3 is about group. Video 4 about tallying number. Jalkari and group are of Yolngu origin. Space grid and tallying number of Western origin. There's a common overlap of creative adaptation. Video 4 is about tallying number. Counting in numbers comes as easily as breathing to most Westerners. Here, we emphasise counting's underlying logic as recursive relations. Since recursive relations are the basic logic of Yolngu thought, this way of approaching tallying number makes it readily accessible in the Ghana Maths program. These are secondary students at Yirkala. They are working with a bachelor college teacher trainee. They are using straws for tallying. Tallying includes counting and adding up. What a tally does is answer the question, how many altogether? The straws are good for tallying aids because they're all alike. They're light and they're easy to handle. The boys are following a rule to do something again and again with the straws. The rule is, when you get to 10, make a bundle. So the way they use the straws makes a recursion, or a recursive practice, an ongoing rerunning. The rule is applied again and again. Here are the boys making bundles of 10 straws using elastic bands.
Oops. So this is the curriculum that we came up with in this moment of reconciliation, and if ever there was an ontic politics, it's in that fraught four interlocking circles. And we take recursion and space as our translating or connecting mechanisms. And there's this tense area of overlapping between these discursive areas that we've named. Now, there's an oddness in that video that we got to after the interaction. You don't usually expect teenage boys to be sitting down bundling straws. One of the reasons is that something odd happens to numbers in this maths curriculum. Numbers are everted. You've forgotten that recursion lies in the core of number because you do it all the time. What this curriculum does is take what's usually inside numbers, that is recursion, and put it on the outside. Those boys are very familiar with numbers. They use them all the time. But by making them do that recursion, we're interrupting and providing the means for them to see a connection between a logic by which a logic of kinship, and anthropologists, of course, have studied kinship for a very long time without calling it a recursion. Kinship is a recursion. Aboriginal Australians live through kinship. They live through a recursion. And one of the delights for me in putting together this, in working in this curriculum, was a very old man who'd had some education through the missionaries, and he was now an elder, and after I'd, in English, talked about recursion and the way in which recursion is in Gurutu. Gurutu is the name for kinship in Yolngu land, and recursion in maths. As it was being translated into Yolngu Mata, this old man got so excited he started to clap. It was really such a moment for me. And then why didn't they tell us that before? Why did they hide that? He then got very angry that this really simple connection had been hidden from him for all these years. And if only he'd known that, he would have been able to get onto numbers properly. So it was moments like this that realise the importance of eversion, remembering what is inside what we do. Okay. I'm going quickly. The third practical ontic, or the third set of practices that I'm going to talk about in ontic politics concern the dead of Gangan. So this is where my refrain comes from. This curriculum development did not occur in the usual way curriculum development occurs in offices in some educational building. It occurred actually in the classrooms where the lessons would be taught. So it was a series of workshops that went on and on and on. Each lesson was, first of all, done in a workshop in a particular place, with elders present, with children present, and with curriculum developers, and I was working as a curriculum development person and teaching in history and philosophy of science at the same time. So this was my research in history and philosophy of science, in thinking about what happens to numbers when you do these odd things with them. Okay, so this was a workshop in Gangan. Gangan is inland from Yirrkala. It takes about an hour on a light plane, and like all outsiders, I'd been adopted into a Yolngu clan, and of course this seems to us who are adopted a wonderful honour. But in fact, it's a means of ensuring that we are in the structures, okay? We can be kept in line, basically, because people become deeply responsible for us. And if we step out of line, well, there are people who bring us into line, okay? This had happened very early on in my involvement with this community. Gangan is the place of my adopted mother's clan live at Gangan. And so it was a special place for me to know about. And in fact, it turned out to be an occasion where I was seriously brought into line. Although it took me some time to work that out. This is in 1990. We 6 or 7 of us go in this light plane to Gangan. There are 3 Aboriginal teachers in a small school. There are about 15 children, and there's the whole community who live at Gangan, living mostly off the land, which is their ancestral land. And our topic is numbers, and where we the topic of the workshop was how to go from this step of recursion. This is quite early in the curriculum development program. How to go from the recognising numbers as recursions to recognising number as value. Number as value is what's really core for Western understandings of number. So this was the topic. I was told, yes, okay, my young mother, many of my mothers will be much younger than me because of the way the kinship works. We'll go and meet country, she says. It's important for me. I realise that it's important for me to meet country. And so we go off in a car after the workshop is over, and we arrive at a sandy spot by a billabong. And she stops the car and we get out. There's a beautiful fruiting tree. And I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up. It was there, she indicated, along that rise, you see, on the other side of the lagoon. It was there that Bilani and his men rode. And she points back towards the yati. All the men were over there doing men's business. And I realised this is the story of a massacre. I've heard about this massacre. And here I am at the spot. It's the story of the massacre, probably in the 1920s. There was a ceremony being held by the Dalwango clan, and the clan was very nearly wiped out in this massacre, and it still struggles to come back to life as a clan. And so my mother pointed out where the men hid, or where the children hid. She picked a water lily and broke the top off, broke the flower off, and showed me that it's like a straw. Many of the children took to the water and breathed through the water lily straws. Then the men came running from their ceremony, and they too were all mowed down. It's even hard now for me to retell the story. Seeing the log where the shooters knelt, and where the trees behind which the men stood as they threw their spears, of course no match for the rifles. And my young mother told me about her grandmother, who was a child whose leg was broken, who tells the story of dragging her leg across the sand, and I see this furrow sort of open up before me. So it's a very distressing episode. Okay, it happened about the time my mother was born, so I'm, as the first Australian in our family, so I'm the second generation. And any Australian confronted with the sight of such massacres realises, that there's a very strong politics here. So later, back at the schoolroom after this, where I'm trying to work out, what do I do with this? What do I make of this? She's a teacher at the school, this young woman, and she goes into a storeroom and brings out a book, a small green covered booklet, and she hands it to me. So this is the story, a true bad story. It's been written down by Wuyuwa Yunupingo. And she has done the illustrations, and there is writing in both Gumach and English, and I'll just read you out the English. All the men were at a private ceremony site in the bush nearby. Children and women were at the camp. Other children and women had gone gathering yams, berries, goannas, and freshwater turtles. None of them knew that a party of men with guns were riding towards the camp on horses. They were led by Bilani, a yellow fella from the Roper River area. The armed band of men rode into the camp and shot the older women. The men heard the shots from their ceremony spot and ran to see what was happening. They saw their wives being shot dead, and they attacked the killers with their spears. But the rifles were too much for the spears, and they were driven back to a large lagoon nearby. Some of the men went into the water and were shot and killed. Other women were shot and killed at the camp. Some escaped with their children, where they were joined with the men. Bodies were lying everywhere, and those who'd escaped watched as Bilhani and his men started their journey back, taking the captives back the way they had come. But that was not the end of the story, though. Bilhani returned the next year and collected the skulls of the people he'd murdered and later sold them to a museum in the southern cities and made a lot of money. And as she handed me this booklet, this young woman whose grandmother had been shot in the leg said, "It's the favourite reader of the children at this school. You know, this book has taught so many children to read and so many children to read English. It's a wonderful book." And it's that feeling of, oh my God, how can a story of a massacre be a reading primer in a classroom within sight of the massacre site? It's this sense of dissonance, this sense of somehow wrongness that really stays with me still. And it was made very clear to me that this was not an oversight on anybody's part. This was part of carrying the dead along. The dead have their place. They have a socio-material existence in that reading book. It's very important. It's about to be put online and become part of it. And of course, it has now a socio-material existence in this room. So, carrying the dead along with us is the refrain. And of course, my beginning feeling, oh, that has no place in a school curriculum. I wanted to separate out that feeling that I had as a professional educator, that has no place in the school curriculum, from the feelings that I legitimately had as a subject confronted with the place of this massacre. I wanted to keep them separate. My feelings as an educator who could make rulings about what is and is not in a curriculum, and my feelings, as you like, as an Australian subject, they seem to be separate. And what I learned was that they're not separate. That in fact, that subjects come into being along with the entities with which that subject engages, in this case, the dead of Gangan. So the refrain, carrying the dead along with us, reminds us that escape to the modern constitution, if you like, whereby a subject can stand aside and say that it has no place in the school curriculum, which is, if you like, a line of flight. That line of flight is blocked by the refrain, and has us staying in the here and now, taking care and concern for what it is that's coming into being, in this case a very unusual curriculum. It interrupts the ever-present danger, which the elders were very aware of, that this curriculum would suddenly be packed up in boxes and go away and be put in books which would return as some set of instructions, modern instructions for a curriculum. The curriculum stays here, is the message. And so the refrain interrupts that, and it interrupts the clotting of that modern knowing subject who worries about having the story of a massacre as a reading primer. Okay, so what I've done really in talking about proliferating bark petitions, marking the ontological changes, if you like, in the Australian polity, the Gama curriculum, and then the refrain of the Dead of Gangan, is to talk about the ontics of a place where we can begin. And of course, I've come to the end of the lecture. So what I did is I began with an allegory for ontics, and that helps us explicitly identify the knowledge politics in the curriculum we were making. And to appreciate this allegory, we needed to, if you like, get into the practical ontics, which I try to embed in this refrain, carrying the dead along. So ontic politics of analysis, which is what I've done to some extent here, lies within the ontic politics of the occasion for thinking that brings it into being. So my hope is that engaging the Ngaptu allegory, we can begin to feel how it is to do analysis in good faith. So what do I take from the Ngaptu allegory? It's about risk-taking. You never really know what's going to come out. It's about showing what's inside, so eversion. It's asking which collective will do this work, and this is important. And this is why I point to our co-participator, 2401A Storage. It helps us remember that there's a collective here doing this work. Where will the resources come from? In other words, which places are we going to carry bags of nuts from? And, of course, built into making analysis, built into making Ngaptu from the cycad nuts, is betrayal. They become something else. And there's no certainty about what they will become. And I think, particularly for analysts, it's about being committed to making our own metaphysical commitments clear in the analyses we do. Thank you.
It's a real honor to have a chance to respond to Professor Verran's paper. And also, I feel incredibly flattered that both Helen and Marisol thought I might be capable of responding, besides possibly being overestimated. It's very clear to me that I can't actually do ontics or ontologies either. The best I can do as part of the material sociality of the room, along with 2401A storage, is enact the serious work of struggling to understand what it is and what it can do. So I'll do my best, and I hope perhaps some of the others of you in the room are also working, and so we'll work together. I've decided to focus on the gift Professor Verran gives us of puzzles within puzzles. Those of you who've read Science in an African Logic might know what I mean. In that book, there's a wicked formal experiment. She divides each section into 3 parts. The first account sets out an argument. The second decomposes the first account, showing us how it's quite wrong. And the third offers a different account that explains the matter again, but with a twist. And all this doing and undoing is very much about indigenous cosmopolitics. The first account proposes an indigenous ontics, a conceptual design. The second explains why such ontics don't exist. And the third offers another way, sometimes a historical context, in which what seems to be an ontology might briefly emerge. So this is challenging and fun, and I'll do my best to follow Professor Verran's lead. Now, to work with puzzles in this way, I thought might be a math curse. I'm referring to an understudied philosophical text. Actually, I'm kidding. It's really a silly children's book. In this book, a girl's teacher puts her under a math curse. On Monday in math class, Mrs. Fibonacci says, you know, you could think about almost anything as a math problem. By Tuesday, there are problems. Math problems jump out of everyday life. What's cool about this book is that the problems are not just problems that math can answer. On every page, there are problems that show the limits of math, the problems that math cannot answer. And here's one of the few that's available on Google Images. It's a problem about dividing 24 cupcakes 25 ways. Now, our protagonist solves the problem by saying that she's allergic to cupcakes, thus reducing the need to 24. We are at math's limits. In the story, the girl becomes obsessed with math problems, and luckily she has a dream in which she figures out that numbers are both one and many and parts and wholes. And that a hole can also be an H-O-L-E, that is a gap through which one might fall, thus surviving the math curse. But that gap is still there, and we, like Alice, are about to tumble in for our own adventures. Now, in the written version of the paper that I am really commenting more than the fantastic oral version, she gives us the cycad ceremony and says, okay, it's your job, readers, to make something of this. This is your work. I want you to figure out how this is an allegory. Now, this is pretty challenging for those like myself who've never ever encountered a Yolngu ceremony or even a cycad. I can say nothing meaningful about Yolngu or even Australia. The best I can do is to ask how this ceremony as a conceptual apparatus might speak to other people in other places. Professor Verran says that the making of bread from cycad nuts is a transformation of a one to a many, to a whole to its parts, through eversion, turning inside out. And this seems to answer the question, how do we come together as a collectivity? But since she asked us to find our own way through the ceremony, I'll draw attention to another question I noticed there. How do we convert poisonous substances into food? The cycad ceremony answers this question too. 2 features of the ceremony, of the answer, jumped out to me. First, it takes a really long time. Only on the 4th day of soaking does the poison start to come out. Now, there are lots of foods that need to be soaked: acorns in California, bitter manioc in the Amazon, milky caps in Finland, but I never knew that they took so long. And if you go on the internet to find out, it gives you all kinds of hints about how you could make the process faster and more efficient. So for me, the ceremony is a making of time for transformations and eversions. Second, the transformation has effects on others, not part of the ceremony. In the written version of the paper, Professor Verran offers this. By the 3rd day, the poison has come frothing out, and you can see dead fish and yabbies. Yabbies, I find, are a kind of crawdad. At least in California, crawdads are hardy souls who live well on the human excrement we insist on leaking into the creeks. I don't think crawdads are in any trouble in northern Australia either, so I'm not bringing up these animals as endangered species. But they're dead, and it seems to me that the transformations of the ceremony have created some more dead to carry. It makes me think about how to carry them, not in guilt, but as part of the world of living and dying we bring with us. Thus, I'm challenged. What kinds of making time can carry not just our dead, but many kinds? Yolngu and Blanda, in the paper, she uses the term, Yolngu term Blanda for white settlers. Human and not human. That's where I will try to take us in following Verran's puzzles within puzzles. I'm amused by the term Blanda because it's the Indonesian term for Dutchmen. So let me start with eversions, turning things inside out, which, in the written version of the paper, there's a lot about a canny ontological politics. And I'm going to talk about the word canny because it stopped me up because I don't use it very often. I had to try and figure out what canny meant. And I think it's still relevant to what she presented orally. Perhaps canny is an eversion of the uncanny, that is a reframing and containment of the uncanny. Now, the uncanny has a particular form in Yolngu country about which Professor Verran tutored us. The uncanny is the possibility that you could be minding your own business and armed men representing settler society might come and murder you and your community. In the picture, we see the killer horsemen already massing behind the trees in the upper right. A canny politics is a politics that recognizes this uncanny and still strives to make reasonable claims. In drawing this sketch, the artist has everted the uncanny to claim that children should be able to read here through a primer that tells the story of the massacre. The uncanny everted becomes the canny. The massacre is harnessed as a primer. Another set of canny eversions is presented in the bark petitions, an amazing enactment of claims for indigenous rights. Which is the heart and which is the frame? The Roman letters are the pictures of country. Through eversion, both formulate and contextualize each other. Furthermore, Professor Verran tells us that the bark petitions are contained within the story of the massacre. Again, this was in the written version. Indeed, the canniness of the petitions is again an aversion of the knowledge of the dead, through which country, and thus indigenous rights, must be constituted again and again. Through such aversions, canny ontological politics is constituted. Each of these objects shows us how to do both ways, that is, both Yolngu and Blanda doings gathered together. The heart of this political pedagogy is the enactment of multiple ontologies, both and. This is central to Professor Verran's longstanding commitment to assisting teaching and learning, to collecting the materials that will allow continuing reference to the knowledge of elderly and passing Yolngu, to opening up history to contain the histories of many others, and to carrying the dead in the most respectful way we might imagine. This is extraordinary work. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to look up her online teaching exhibit, Singing the Land, Signing the Land, you should. You're in for a treat. I'd like to leave it there with praise, but that's not very Verranian. So let me try an exercise in decomposition. Aversion also contains frightening possibilities. What if the aversion of both and ontologies is something disturbing and dangerous? Perhaps a yellow fella ontology. Now, the yellow fellow we heard about today is the murderer, Blarney, a yellow fellow from the Roper River area. The yellow fella is the collaborator, the traitor, La Malinche. He is the one who knows the country well enough to lead soldiers in. The yellow fella has a gun. He knows the master's tools. But besides the gun, consider the fact that in this illustration, we watch the massacre safely behind Blarney and his men. We do not face the guns with the Yolngu elders. Our position as spectators means something. We read, we write, we have the master's tools. We watch over the murderer's shoulder. Yellowfellow ontology tars all who practice reading with that primer, and all of us in this room, whatever our racial makeup. We are students, teachers, and translators. For aren't we race traders? I'm reminded that in the US right-wing fantasy, The Turner Diaries, a special fate is saved for mixed-race people and university professors, together hung by the neck on lampposts as public examples. But we are dangerous as well as vulnerable. Among other things, we destroy the possibility of multiple ontologies, clean and clear, even as we promote them. For what could a Yellowfella ontology possibly be except a contradiction in terms? The Yellowfella is a figure of shreds and patches. Her body cannot support a coherent logic, a philosophy of being. She exudes incoherence. Her logics are imitation, collaboration, and confusion. She cannot voice an ontology. But even in her broken state, perhaps this figure has some use for thinking about both and, that is, multiple ontologies. At least for me, she requires a slowing down, a taking time for at least two nagging questions. First, as a new form of postcolonial theory, how might ontological politics get into dialogue with the old kind of postcolonial theory that came out of Asia? In that world, no one wanted to evoke traditional authority since that was the master's tools. No South Asian, for example, would argue that logics of caste offer a radical edge. After all, British colonialism supported those logics. For Indigenous people in Australia and the Americas, the situation is quite different. Indigenous elders were ignored and exterminated, not offered the power of indirect rule. But might there be some useful conversation between these approaches? One place to begin the conversation might be in reconsidering the units and situations of ontology. Who needs an ontology, we might ask, and under what circumstances? Rather than beginning with sets of coherent logics, which require everyone to have them, might it be possible to begin instead with the question of when and how they arise? Perhaps ontologies arise out of events and conjunctures, including ceremonies and workshops, rather than pre-existing them. Ontologies, I think, are not essential properties of kinds of people or of giant projects such as science or modernity. Instead, they emerge from situations in which people are challenged to devise coherent conceptual logics for generating the world. Sometimes situations are persistent, allowing long-term manifestations of ontic skills. But the starting place in dealing with the questions raised by the impossibility of a Yellowfella ontology is to consider the historical shaping of ontological opportunities. Thus, too, the question of whether an ontological politics is a canny politics might depend not only on the skill of practitioners, but also on whether the situation calls for the play of ontologies at all. For Yolngu, I'm convinced it does, but perhaps not universally. Before I get into even more trouble, let me turn to my second decomposing question. What kinds of dialogue does ontological politics offer to other species? I understand that indigenous ontologies do species differently. Still, I've not yet seen discussion of how other living things participate themselves in the world's ontologically minded scholars sketch for us. This seems to me in part because ontological politics requires conceptual logics, and other living things may not do worlds through concepts. This doesn't mean they should be excluded. I think of a line I found in another of Professor Verran's articles in which she explains that according to Deleuze, concepts should always be thought together with affects and percepts. I haven't read the original Deleuze, and I don't know what he means by percept, but it seems to have something to do with perception, what one notices in the world. Now, other species may not organize world-making through concepts, but they are just as good at percepts as we are. Might it be possible sometimes to stage a politics of percepts rather than concepts? Let me give an example from my own research. Since I don't know what a percept is anyway, I'll use my own vocabulary and speak of noticing. I've been following a wild mushroom called matsutake, including to forests in Japan and China. In central Japan, no one would use the word indigenous, but it might be possible to say that I learned an alternate ontology. People showed me how to do forests. They had logical and coherent concepts for knowing and making forests. They knew these were not the same as powerful international forest logics. They were proud of their difference in part because doing forests in central Japan is making time for carrying the dead. It reconstitutes a traditional rural countryside that seems worth caring for. This takes work. It's not the so-called natural forest Americans imagine. And here's a painstakingly revived peasant pine forest. This work in making what one could call country brings together many kinds of people, including scientists, volunteers, and farmers. They've developed their ontics together. But when I went to Southwest China, things were not like this. Forest managers were in a period of conceptual flux. They were rejecting what had come before as communist mistakes. Japanese models interested some, but many wanted to catch up with the West and with neoliberalism. They also wished to integrate this with various Chinese populisms. New local practices spread, but then quickly declined. Varied ideologies were put forward, but great gaps loomed between ideologies and practices. My collaborator, Michael Hathaway, speaks of this as winds. Winds course through both remote villages and central research institutes. This was not an auspicious time and place for talking about ontology. Yet the Yi farmers in the mountains where I brought my research were delighted to show me how to notice, especially in those verges and ecotones once classified as state-condemned barren land, but now sites to find all matter of potentially profitable non-timber forest products. Here is where we graze the goats. Here are the plants we use to feed the pigs. Here are the places for finding mushrooms. The training they gave me in noticing also included attention to how other organisms responded, that is, the forms of noticing that practiced by other species. Here is an oak that grows quickly back from coppicing. Here is how pines take to cutting off their branches. This is the weed that most quickly covers disturbed ground. With their help, I did get a sense of how people did forest, but it was never an exercise in conceptual logics. In fact, the noticing contradicted every general principle that anyone tried to teach me. Farmers here are being asked to look forward, to leave their dead behind. But this is a haunted landscape full of ghosts, including those who died of starvation during the Great Leap of the 1950s and early 1960s. This was a time, too, when forests were butchered to fuel backyard furnaces for steel production. Noticing today is a part of living in damaged places. Noticing is making of time for getting by, carrying the dead, human and not human. But I haven't left much time for a third account, a third layer of puzzling, so let me rush back from rural China and from decomposition to teaching and learning here and there in California and around the world. What is our task as students, teachers, and translators? One of the things we do is make time through our teaching and writing, time for transformation and for carrying the dead. We soak our psychhead nuts and look for mushrooms. We refuse to scale up into those forms of modern science in which generalization precedes attention. Whether we're working with ontological politics or with politics of noticing, we wait for poison to turn into food. Ontological politics does this by interrupting business as usual. In the process, it strategically accepts conceptual reification, ignoring its historicity. Politics of noticing instead blurs and blends many kinds of knowledge practices, even non-human ones, in order to enlarge the world-making space for living in common. Ontological edges are erased, but historical conjunctures come to the fore. I can't see any reason why these practices should not each find their place in the toolkit of any scholar. Both aim to build worlds in which difference is not condemned and in which learning might open minds rather than beat them into submission. How do we make the kinds of time that might allow this? The first time I met Professor Verran at a workshop, she taught me something important about making time, and I've been puzzling with her insight ever since. The insight is the here and now. This is a time that must be made. It cannot be taken for granted. It assembles pasts, presents, and futures, making them usable for world-making activities. It refuses the relentless push to erase pasts as demanded by those who require progress. It refuses the endless present of appeals to natural law. Professor Verran tells of a Yolngu ceremony in which at the end of the work, an elder throws a spear, congealing past, present, and future into the here and now, the time that carries the dead, and the time of possible getting on together. This, too, is the work of scholars who each throw a spear to congeal our evocations of spaces and times for teaching and learning. Each work of scholarship assembles a here and now. By guiding us through the cycad ceremony, Professor Verran shows us how that here and now might make the time for others, living and dead. As I fall back out of the hole that is the wholes and parts and ones and manys and puzzles within puzzles, I'd like to hold on to that lesson in making time differently to turn poison into food. Time for puzzles, that is time for the indeterminacy of encounters. Time for math inside math, that is for questions that are not easily answered. I hope the here and now with which I leave you has enough variegated pasts and futures within it to offer a meal worth sharing. Thank you.
Okay. I have been following Helen's work only for a little while. I've been cramming as much as I could, and it leaves me, the various things I've been reading, I've been trying to concentrate on the Australia-oriented work. It leaves me either completely silenced or wanting to speak endlessly in response to what she's done with Australian Worlds. In her written paper, she invited us to make what we would of her allegories, and I was very tempted to simply turn to all my China material and start stating a bunch of things that should have been obvious to me long ago, but which suddenly only appeared to me after reading Helen's papers. This is kind of a theme for my moment here, is stating the obvious. Because I think, as I looked at Helen's work and I thought about the work I've been doing for years and years, especially about traditional Chinese medicine, I've had this feeling that we talk and somehow nothing happens. And I feel that Helen's been talking much more effectively than I have. So I start going back to what should have been obvious all along, but which somehow I've never articulated in my work. Helen's material sent ahead was so wonderful, so exciting, so full of fun ideas. I love plotting and unclotting of the real, the voice of the dead in writing, the play of language beyond representation, that is a kind of pragmatics, which is, I think, not fully worked out yet in everything you say and do, but it's definitely extremely important. Like Anna, I'm fascinated by the Nafu cycad nut process, and I want to go back to that a little bit. I'm interested in the talk today in recursion in a new way, numerical kinship and textual recursions, and what they tell us about time and the doing of history. What I have prepared involves, of course, my usual obsessions: knowledge, language, and the state. So let me just start with a comparison between Helen's situations, research situations, and my very parallel obsessive involvement with research in China, with various other worlds or other things presented to me in China. And I think there's one frame that we both have accepted years ago, because all the people we work with in Australia and China accept this frame, and that's the hegemonic claims of global science. But it's only slowly crumbling metaphysical foundations and its sovereign commitment to a narrow practice of reason, a narrow naturalism that excludes all kinds of things a priori, such as excluding, for example, the imaginary or supernatural, the non-quantifiable, anything that violates the materialist objectivist causalities that require abstract space and time for their plausibility. For my own convenience, refer to this objectivist realism in the sciences as modernism, because with modernism I want to invoke kinds of writing and an aesthetic, along with the modern Constitution, which was so neatly abstracted out from our non-modernity body tour. I'm not trying to call this modernist science the enemy, because it is a very good ally, much more an ally than antagonist for many that I work with in China. But I do see it as setting the frame of knowledge, the topic, in both Helen's fields and mine. It's a frame in the sense that even the other scientific knowledge organizes itself within or outside this frame and claims a character as knowledge in place of or alongside or just as modernist scientific facts. In both Australia and China, moreover, it's crucial that science is propagated by the state, and the state has a stake in truth as it is arrived at by science. And of course, this is not true of everywhere. Australia and China are a particularly nice comparison because of the importance of state knowledge regimes. State science operates in fields where much is at stake. Helen's preferred example in many of her works is land management, which is important because the health of the environment cannot be confined just to those lands over which Aboriginal groups have rights. And of course, with land there are tons of competing interests, some of them violent, some of them having to do with agriculture or nature preserves, etc. Moreover, much is at stake in medical treatments, the kinds of things I worry about in China, for the treatments for the complex bodies of citizens whose good care founds the legitimacy claims of the state in biopolitical modernity. Over these kinds of issues, land management and bodies, healthy or ill bodies, over these issues, everyone is afraid of getting it wrong. And hardly anyone is explicit about their most fundamental ontic or metaphysical commitments or orientations, those non-rational orientations that guide our evaluation of what is true and good. The production of true knowledge and the comparison of long-standing yet contrasting knowledge regimes are major industries supported and surveilled by both of these states. But this commitment to truth is the first and constantly returning sticking point, maybe especially in Arnhem Land. If truth can only be realized in a representational language or a systematic code, such as numerical quantification, then communities that use language differently to mobilize truth usefully for themselves are up a creek. Representationalism in modernist language is its own metaphysics, dividing being into signifier and signified word and thing, in a hegemonic realist or modernist language practice, and then turning on us quite unfairly to demand that every word must invoke a thing. Especially in English, though not so much in Chinese, and I'm wondering about Yolngu now, there's a bias toward nominals. In English, there's a bias toward nominals. Because we have the word body, for example, individual bodies offer themselves to us as natural things in a reciprocally posited environment. Because we have the word text, we can identify the beginnings and ends that bound an instance of discourse, and then place our discrete texts carefully in their proper contexts. The story, a biography, an image is an example of a text that scholarship contextualizes. Representational realism opens the door, one could even say the wide portal, to symbolic analysis. And here, I'm stating the obvious for this audience, but I keep having to go back to this because somehow the world hasn't quite heard this yet. Opening the door to symbolic analysis, the language of belief and social psychology. When primitives are imagined to believe something they represent to themselves, their symbols have power, but only over consciousness, or, in the case of perhaps Levi-Strauss and the effectiveness of symbols, over the unconscious. At its Durkheimian strongest, the power of representation to affect a collective mental transformation alters social form in a way that might be outside the consciousness of individual actors, but which is thoroughly constitutive of their experienced moral reality, moral, of course, Durkheim's term. Social worlds differ, but because they are social, seen as such within that modernist invention, society, they can still be seen as nothing more than complex points of view on a single world. Beliefs, cultures, symbolic systems, and so on, as points of view on a world. Even allegory, which I love as a concept and a practice, worries me in both Helen's and Anna's papers. Representation for modernist realist sociologists does not literally make forms of being. It doesn't even make local truths. More likely, representational culture makes local folly. Think about the bark petitions that Helen showed us. The normal way to recuperate the political gesture of these Aboriginal bark petitions, it would seem, is to see them as important symbols for Aboriginal groups and, by extension, for Australians. Those who offered the petitions were believed by officialdom, at least for a while, to believe in the demands represented in the words typed on the bark surface and the meaning encoded in the painted designs around the edge. That is, these documents had to have been read at certain times by their targets as saying something in language or codes. But what was not fully read, perhaps, although maybe in Australian politics it came to be read, was the power move of the event of proffering the things themselves as possible configuring agents or operators in a highly consequential relationship between communities. An effort to encompass Australian state power somehow, although this is an area in which I not only don't know what was going on when these petitions were offered, I can't know, no matter how much more I study about it. I think that there's always a kind of temporally located politics in these kinds of practices of making texts do something beyond what they say on the bark. So here I think of Helen's use of Rossier in her paper that she sent ahead. She quotes him as saying, "There is in politics a basic quarrel as to what understanding language implies. That quarrel is politics." So the modernist political appropriation of the Aboriginal petitions with their demands, whether this modernist appropriation saw these petitions as successful eventually, or never successful, or temporarily not successful, this ignores the key element of the event, the effort to appropriate Australian national politics with what? Some form of power that in our histories is very difficult to avert and understand historically and in practice. Along these lines, Helen has made the wonderful point that in the Bill Harney Massacre book, and she's made this in her written paper and then slipped away from me in the speaking, right? In the Bill Harney Massacre book, the dead are not represented, rather they are speaking. And I would extend this point to say they speak again and again as children again and again read that book. That in the act of reading, we have an act of speaking by the dead. Even more difficult to accept with the Natu ceremony at Birani. The ancestors, with the help of many contemporary agents, are configuring stuff in the actual world, actually. The ceremony of making Natu is different from the allegory, which was given to Helen as a gift. That ceremony is a speaking, an action of the ancestors and contemporaries. So these actions, read locally, it seems to me, I'm wildly guessing, are in fact a terrible betrayal of modernist scientific realism. And I keep thinking if only such things could be perceived as being dangerous by Australia's scientific moderns or non-moderns. Past and future, I want to talk about. Past and future, but wait, I can't use those words, I don't think, in a place where temporal recursions are so important. So I want to talk about the already happened once or twice, and the hasn't yet happened again, as being bent and folded in the reading and in the processing of the psychic nuts. Further, in the frequent visits to places for ritual or education or alliance making, as with Helen's walks to meet country, the empty homogeneous time and space of modernism are not just filled with feeling and meaning. This we see a lot in anthropology. Time and space are filled with meaning. This would be the tolerant liberal view with its turn to the symbolic. Rather, these times and spaces are violated as such and replaced with a space-time, the dimensional, full space-time suffused with powers to command and configure contemporary lives. Now I want to say something about the state and truth, because I do think that states are pretty committed to policing the truth. The word truth always reminds me of my old friend Stephen Toulmin's point that he used to make about what truth is anyway in English. He pointed out that truth is an Anglo-Saxon word that comes from the idea of troth, that commitment to form a family that is pledged. I pledge thee my troth in a betrothal. If truth or troth is an operator of commitment, then it needs to be only realist enough to stabilize 2 points of view into an alliance that can then accumulate other allies. The truth that puts two actors on the same page for long enough to begin to form a life together needs to be trustworthy. It needs to keep from dissolving before other operators are recruited to do some of its betrothing and committing work. And it needs to persuade us that it has some relationship with the actual, but not necessarily as representation. Could be representation, but there are plenty of other things it could be doing. Truth games can be played without much commitment to naturalizing purifications or to the objectifying moment of practice, a la Bourdieu, or to reifications for comparison. Truth games can be played in many, many ways if we see them as ways of pledging a troth. But this cutting loose from representation in a pragmatic idea of truth works only if we're willing to place some trust in our fellow players. The problem that kind of breaks my heart about Helen's examples again and again, and it is that, my heart is also used to being broken in China. The problem is the world that Helen's friends must live in seems to me to be so lacking in real trust. The only world seems so vulnerable, so often made to seem contingent on their being recognized by somebody in pedagogy, in ritual, in tour guiding. If an ancestor walks or animals convene for a ritual in a country and no one notices, if the elders throw a ceremony and no one shows up, no worries. The actual, read modernist world perdures, because it is, of course, the only one that is really, really real. And it will continue to map the space and record the chronologies of Aboriginal life. Anytime Yolngu people want to entertain themselves and teach their children by invoking the dreaming and the footsteps of the ancestors, fine, no problem, because the world they materialize in a constantly interrupted kind of way is no threat to the local representatives of the state. Of course, I don't really believe a world achieved in the way the Yolngu know how, or the way my friends who heal in the mountains of southern China. I don't really believe these worlds can be interrupted. I think we have to see and know that something like the dreaming really is always active in the present, just as I have to assume that Qi is busily filling out and configuring every part of my body, and Marisol's dog Gabi, and that tree outside. But for some reason, my biomedical colleagues don't accept this imperative that I have to accept. The ongoing, demanding, lived world of the dreaming is no threat except in arenas like land management. Back to ontic politics. That's why this is such an important example for Helen, and why so much ontic work is required with all its losing battles and shortfalls of comparison. She shows us here that ontic or metaphysical working together is always political, always historical, in the sense that the already happened once or twice cannot be banished into a representation of the past, and the tending toward a not yet, in which terrible and wonderful things happened, yet happened again, cannot be made into an uplifting story of liberal hope for the future. But this is why I love Helen's constant refrain of going on together. Attracted as I am to detours, workarounds, escapes, and evasions, As much as I love the wild practices that are partly valorized in the South China Mountains, I'm now visiting as often as I can, I don't imagine any freedom from state realism, state science, official representation. These are still the hegemonic frame of the publicly acknowledged. We have no choice but to go on together with instituted powers. The question Helen still asks, and I want to echo, is, can we all feel our way forward in the uninterrupted co-presence of more than one trusted world? Now, I want to just go back to the Ngāpu ceremony for a moment. It's so telling for me. We didn't get all the details in exactly the order that I sort of worked out from the paper that was sent ahead. So let me just state a few obvious things about Ngāpu Saikadnut processing. Collecting, opening, drying. Collecting, opening, drying, regathering, soaking, leaching, which is an activity of the things themselves. Grinding, forming into loaves. There's many transformations, as Anna emphasizes, over a rather long period of time. There's distributed activity, a drawing out and making use of some properties, but not others. The hardness of the cycads, for example, is defeated immediately at the beginning of the process. And there's a telos that can vary between the mundane and pleasurable. You know, this cycad bread is good to eat, especially after you've been eating too much seafood. And another kind of telos, political and social differentiating. The loaves are distributed in certain ways. There's to certain different kinds of people. There are, the materials are ranked differently, and they express a social order, or they re-express, re-sustain a social order or a political order in certain ways. There is in the story, as Helen has told it, a representing moment, both in the descriptive booklet that she uses to explain this processing ritual, and in the figure drawn in the sand for Helen. Someone trying to explain to her what is this that's going on, draws a figure in the sand for Helen so that she can see the logic of the process. And this is an allegory. It's given to her as a gift, as it were. But it's also a set of actions which are positioned in political time and carefully located in place. I think even more interesting, an ordinary modernist reader of the Allegory, no matter how sensitive and interpretively talented she might be, might not notice the eversion aspect of this cycad processing process. Helen notices because it's pointed out to her with emphasis. Look, we open them up. We draw out the poisons which they have compacted within them. And this is an essential transformation which we're visiting upon them. Strathern obviously is mentioned in this description of eversion, and Strathern notices eversion in a seemingly mundane encounter between white men and Haganers in Highland Papua New Guinea. She notices it because for Haganers, some of their perceptual activity is an everting decomposition of objects which only have an apparent integrity. So I'd like to push the eversion of the Ngāpu into a sort of style of doing history. A history that gathers some obvious objects belonging to a pre-known and particularly valued class. Opening up these objects to view what has come to be clotted or impacted inside these simple objects. Enabling the hidden powers and poisons and dangers to come out and boil up into perceptibility, which boiling up, which becoming visible, is enabled by a relation with some powers of the place. The cycads are soaked in a particular water, a particular billabong, right? is where their poisons can be released. This eversion is a drawing out and making explicit a danger that needs to be contained and carefully managed with a kind of reprocessing, not just in allegory, but in the ritual itself, in the formation of something new, in the transformation. It is a violent breaking down or grinding of a now altered object, the altered object integrity of the things, to make them into one substance. What is this one substance historically? How can we imagine it? How can we allegorize it? Discourse, dreamtime, the Tao. There's all sorts of ones that we might imagine are briefly there in a process like this. A very powerful, these kinds of ones, unitary things are very powerful, the result of a very powerful reduction and abstraction. And then to turn to making this one into objects again, objects which have been thoroughly processed by humans, although it's a collaborative process, obviously. Objects which are known as historical, their past is now explicit because they've been everted. Their hidden depths have been brought out and made useful and safe. Multiple objects have been produced. They can be distributed differentially to differentiable people. So I'm left with my initial sense of despair. We talk and nothing happens. Still, we not quite moderns are doing history and making it useful and processing its units, refrying them, and redistributing them in new narratives. But I keep wondering what difference does it make in the terrain of our world. I'm afraid Mao Tzu is much more powerful than the historiography that we're able to engage in.
What I propose we do now, it's 6, is if Helen wants to comment on the comments, we can have that for a bit. And then we'll engage in a conversation of us about these dense, difficult, and inspiring conversation that we've already been having. So Helen, do you want to?
I want to just make a short comment. First of all, to thank Anna and Judith for their comments. And to note that somehow we managed to do a collective presentation without even talking to each other about it. When I came to make an oral presentation out of the text I sent, which was a long, sprawling text, I was in despair. How do I talk this? It's 5 hours. And so I felt I was being a stone that just dropped across some of what I wanted to say to give flavours, I suppose. And then wonderfully, Judy and Anna come along and fill it all in. It was great. And say such insightful things that I hope that I will be able to get their texts and think further with them. So thank you both.
Okay, so now we, the audience, have the floor. And we want to say all those things that we have been thinking and cannot quite articulate. So we're all entitled to start our questions by saying, I don't know how these will come out, but this is more or less what I'm thinking about.
I will start with a very silly question. I will take to look very silly. Can you walk me through this idea that numbers and kinship are a recursion? as recursive part.
Okay. A recursion occurs when you have a set of elements. In other words, in Longmata, or in Gurutu, Gurutu is the form of kinship that organizes your mula. And it's really important in anthropology. It was the Minervan controversy in the beginning of the 20th century. So it's been there in anthropology right from the beginning. So a recursion is a set number of elements that are that one goes through the set number of elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 is the start of going through the same elements, but at a different level. And it's this, so that's easy. With base 10 we get it. In Gurutu, the recursion actually names the relation, and it's 2 to the power of it's 2 to the power of 3. In other words, 2 parents across, or 2 humans across 3 generations, and that is comes up to 16 core relations, which are named from both sides, and then there's a null point. And the null point is brother and sister. I've made a real hash of it, but it's basically two people across 3 generations, 2 to the power of 3.
So after the 3 generations, it starts again.
Yes.
Susanna, did you have a question? No? I have a similar beginner question. I want to know, when you talked about ontic politics and ontological politics, you made a difference, but the difference derived from ontic and ontological. And I kept thinking, why doesn't that difference affect the notion of politics? And so I want to know again, I think I understand ontological politics because you explained it more. With ontic politics, you said images do work. And when you talked about ontological politics, you said we talk about what we're doing. So I didn't get the difference that much, and I want the difference more to come from how ontic and ontological affect the word politics. Yeah, it's just to understand.
Yeah, politics, of course, is, I'm still working my way towards seeing that that's a very nice question. And
I didn't get it, so that's why I asked.
yes, and it does make a difference. And it's very hard to explain the difference of doing ontic politics and doing ontological politics. It feels different. You know when you're doing ontic politics and when you're doing ontological politics. I think you're bringing out different aspects of the ontology of politics. And so I think in ontic politics you're engaging much more with that quarrel over the nature of language and the origins of language in particular. The nature of language. And in ontic politics you can't get away from from even predication in language, do you know what I mean? Predication and designation in language are forms of bodily expression. And so in ontic politics, you know that in a profound way. But in ontological politics, you can think that predication and designation are socially constituted norms. And so I think what happens in politics is actually often a slippage between the, and that's what the quarrel is.
Could I just extend that question a minute? It seems to me if worlds, if there really are different worlds, and there are politics for different worlds, then we have to answer that question, ontic and ontological, as, well, it depends.
Yes.
What's the difference? What is the politics in question? So that I can think about Chinese Qing dynasty imperial politics, where ideologies, written ideologies, were used in certain ways, but ritual was used in other ways. So I would say that for the Qing emperors, ritual was ontic politics, and their deployment of texts was ontological politics. But one could not give that answer for any other space-time, right? So it might be useful to make that distinction anywhere, although I'm not sure I would go to it for Qing imperial politics. It seems to me it was all ontic politics, but because words, texts have certain powers. But nevertheless, it might be a useful distinction for some worlds, but whatever its referent is, whatever the referent of the two kinds of politics is, would be different everywhere.
Yes.
Not everywhere, but different in many places.
So, and I think another time where this comes into play is the ontic politics of working in the laboratory of science. It's different to the ontological politics when you're not in the laboratory. And in a way, that's the hardest thing for young scientists to learn. And they must learn it very well.
So, just for the fun of it, so I plugged in the ontic in Google Translate into Chinese and ontological, and they gave me exactly the same translation. It's really interesting. I imagine I'll have a really hard time explaining to Chinese.
Ontic is 本质主义吗?
So 本体主义.
But they're both a 主义.
They are 本体的 because it's an adjective.
Oh,
right? So ontology will be true. Anyway, it's very interesting. Trying to figure out, I get what you say, the difference in the talk, but I guess this is certainly can't take for granted. Yeah, when you switch to different audience, you have to really explain. But I want to kind of play with this a little bit with maybe Judith. If we want to borrow this ontic politics and this notion in the context of China, say in your field, for example, Chinese medicine, what does ontic politics look like in that context? And if there's such thing, we can approach that. What would be you see as the fundamentals, the core, at this ontic politics in Chinese medicine? I'm just throwing it back to you.
I don't think there's an essence. I think there are a lot of ontic moves. For example, the power of herbal medicines, which is herbal medicines or natural medicines, which is a very, very lived, felt quality in things. So that, and people use they use these medicines in combination. You could argue, if we're going to play in this way, you could argue that putting different natural medicines together in a prescription is a kind of politics. And it's a highly, highly attended to process. the core of the practice of Chinese medicine. So that the use of real stuff to change the configuration of real stuff is in contested, resource-poor environment. I think that could be seen as a kind of politics. Then in one of my 2 papers that I sent, the Cape Town paper, I have Lu Guangqin doing a kind of ontological politics, where he's talking about he's characterizing objects in a way that is absolutely inconsistent with modernist science, and yet saying this is the only reasonable way to characterize these objects, and these are in fact the objects that we use in healing.
I guess if I switch my question a little bit, is that what can we gain through the lens of politics when we look at Chinese medicine, then looking through the lens of
Symbolism?
Ontological politics. I mean, what other things you learn through this particular lens? I think, like you have done a lot of research.
Well, what you do is you invade the world of a symbolic logic. You invade the world of mere representation and psychological experience. You recover a kind of agency which doesn't require psychology. I could go on, but it would be a bore.
Sorry, and this is sort of belaboring the point, but so is an ontic politics different than the enactment of a world, or is that the same thing?
You certainly enact in ontic politics, and ontic politics is often found in enactments. But then you also need to enact in your doing of ontological politics as well. So enactment is probably not going to get you to the difference of feeling that you need to be able to pick up. You're trying to differentiate them. One is enacted and one isn't. Or
I guess I'm thinking of like practices and doing, if that's what we're getting at an ontic politics.
That is part of what we're getting at.
Sorry. Sure. I'm going to try and liven you guys up. So I'm going to try a harder question to you guys. I mean, why isn't the world like this room full of all kinds of ontological practices that only congeal at moments when we're sort of forced to, a kind of paper that I'm sure is familiar to everybody, but I think of a paper by Amitabh Bhaskar where they were starting a park in India somewhere, and they had to have traditional knowledge experts and modern knowledge experts, and they got together and they produced traditional knowledge and modern knowledge out of it. But that in any actual situation before that, part of her point was when you walk around the village, they have all kinds of knowledges going on at the same time. They're enacting many, many kinds of presumptions about world making all at the same time that blur and mess each other up. What makes, in each of your accounts, under what conditions do things congeal into either an ontic or an ontology?
Well, I think you're walking around the village and, ontics are happening all around you. And I tend to, because I notice such things, I've taught myself to notice such things, I stand there and think, how did they do that? They knew how to do it. They knew how to go on. They knew how to go on, and everybody else knew how to go on. I wouldn't have known how. I'm totally surprised about what comes next, very, very often. And so that shows me that, okay, there's an ontics happening there that is opaque to me.
But why would there be 25 ontics?
Why would there be 25?
Just make that number completely right.
Why wouldn't there be? Why wouldn't there be? That your question was why was my question?
Yeah. We all know someone who's identified 15. Yeah. That's enough.
Okay.
So there could be, but that would be an ontological politics to a certain of 25.
But what I mean is, but they could all be blurring and shifting and making a mess much of the time.
Yes, they are. But, we could say they're 15. But that's an ontological politics, which is the same sort of ontological politics I did when I saw, a Yoruba number enacted in a science lesson that I could have said, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. Or I could have said, well, it's really the same. And either of those responses would have been an ontological politics. And anybody who's read Science in an African Logic, I'm talking about the very first story is Mr. Ojo, which of course I've done very often in talks, and half the audience will say, well, it's exactly the same. And the other half will say, oh, that's really interesting. I always want to do the experiment of if the same person will sometimes have different responses depending on how I told the story. There's always a blurring between ontic and ontological. There's always, as soon as you start talking about what we're doing here, you're pushing towards an ontological politics.
Well, maybe this is a banal question, but I'm struggling with the allegory because so you presented us the story through the film, and you said I want to present it because that's the way they own it. So who owns the allegory?
The Gumash Club.
No, but so they see it as an allegory?
Yeah.
No.
And also, no. It's an allegory and a ceremony and a performance and a food, and you can do it if you're just hungry.
So it's not a representational allegory?
Not at all, no. And so this is why it was really important for everybody to participate in the actual work of the long work of doing this allegory. But they were using the English word allegory. Oh, we're going to, you've got to come and you'll have to come for a week because we're going to do the Natu allegory.
Okay.
But I feel that that there is a distinction between that allegory is at one end of the spectrum of representational tactics. The allegory is interesting because it's read and it's reimagined in rich ways. That's why it's so much better than metaphor, for example. So we read allegory to reimagine something that had something to do with its source.
But this is a great example of what I'm trying to argue, which is allegory is a word, and you guys think you know what it means, that it's part of a representational ontology, because you think you already know what a representational ontology is. But in fact, these young people know an English word. It's called allegory. They made it into something else that means taking part in a ceremony.
But they're also giving it to Helen, right? So they from the story that Helen's been giving us, that Naku becomes an allegory partly as part of a gift to her, right?
But so then carry it around.
And declare its ownership, right? So that's why I think allegory is the right word. I'm, being the tiny-minded epistemologist about this, but
Well, I think it's the world, and it's the word and the work that it does in all these layers of translation. Because then, when you, Judith, were talking about the book, the short story, where the act of reading becomes a way of speaking.
Yeah.
So that also the book as an allegory, but as an allegory that becomes something completely different from what we think we know what it means.
Right.
So.
In fact, I wouldn't use allegory for that myself.
You wouldn't,
No.
yeah.
And could I just quickly reply to Anna's question about ontological and ontic? I don't quite agree with a lot of what you were saying in your comments about that ontologies come into being for occasions in a politics or ethics even. Because it seems to me that working in China with Chinese medicine, being is not optional. Being as it's lived in a habitus of doctors and patients and healers up in the mountains now for me, it's not optional, and it's not readily interrupted, but it's usually very tacit. So the great thing about traditional Chinese medicine is that it rides on some moments in the long Chinese history when ontology was actually being done and written, right? And being was being characterized for political reasons. So you're right that when ontology is done, it's in response to a possibly conflictual situation or occasion. But the ontic that is being addressed in this ontological work is not optional. It doesn't go away. And it's an assumed ground of action. And that's why it's not, there aren't 25,000 of them. There aren't even 45 in this room, right? But there are, there are some, redundancies, some vast redundancies in the being that's shared by people with a similar history and a similar position in life. That's my feeling about what that word means. I'm trying to be a high-minded epistemologist.
I was trying to go back to the word vagueness that was in the beginning of your remarks.
Could you speak up, Tim?
Yeah.
Vagueness? I was wondering if you could talk, maybe all of you, but maybe just you, about the relationship between the line you're drawing from vagueness to episode and to details. Because I get the sense that you are trying to let vagueness stay vague, and that's somehow important to your conception of an ontic, or of what the politics of ontics and ontic configurations can be, but that needs to be routed through particular, maybe particular here and nows, or particular spaces and times, or particular projects, or maybe in a particular encounter. So, and I wonder if you opened us with vagueness, you routed us through three very grounded and like concrete stories. But there's a kind of evocation in them too, right? I'll take my disclaimer now. I don't know where I want to go with it, but I wonder whether that's related to the kind of movement we were doing in this room in arguing about ontics and ontologies, and then the going between that discussion and these particular examples. I wonder if those are your spears, Anna, and whether spears are themselves both vague and highly concrete, right? Whether there's a difference between throwing a spear, or what the differences are between throwing a spear and writing a book, or reading a book, or taking a pulse. Now I feel bad that that's all vague.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And in fact, you gave the answer along as you made the question. So I feel honored that you told it in that way. Yes, indeed. Vagueness, I want to keep that vagueness there. But oddly, the only way I can keep that vagueness there is to do it very specifically, very specific here and now, very even specific socio-materialities of particular he's and nows. So there's a peculiar, always paradox in doing vagueness, because you can only conjure the vagueness with a very particular. And oddly, so this trick of pointing to 2401A storage, that's a trick by which you do vagueness. It's very odd. 2401A storage is an irrelevant detail, and it's not seemingly irrelevant to what we're doing here. Of course it's not, but I use that to conjure up the overwhelming vagueness. So I only bring vagueness into the room through a very specific. Okay, so where might we go with it? And are we rehearsing it when we try to say when is it ontic and when is it ontological, and how do we feel the difference, and what difference does it make to politics? Yes, I think we are. Of course, vagueness is very difficult for epistemology. The epistemic has a great deal of problem with vagueness. And so it's very irritating for epistemologists. And that's interesting, I think. So learning how to do vagueness, and do vagueness well, is quite hard. And I think Judith referred to it when she pointed out the fact that my ongoing attempt to evade representationalism, and that's me still learning how to do vagueness well.
Gangan and then Marianne.
So I'm going to risk kind of asking the obvious question, but I'm very excited about interruption, the idea of interruption. And I think that's one of the sort of lively exciting things that you, if I understand correctly, are suggesting that ontic politics can do. And so you talked about how ontic politics, or carrying the dead along with us, can interrupt the possibility of capture, the possibility of incorporation, or it can interrupt you, the analyst. It catches us by surprise in a certain sense. So I wondered if perhaps we could think for a minute about what that means ethnographically, what that means for writing and for research, and how we, and how that's also a sort of political project to write ethnographically that moment of interruption, to sort of bring that forward and highlight that power that seems like something very powerful that ontic politics does. And so I wonder, maybe for all three of you, if there's something about that ethnographic process, both the research and then the writing, where you're dwelling on that moment of an interruption and thinking about how that, even in writing that as a kind of a political project, right, to bring that forward. But it seems like there's a lot of power there.
I'll say something because it's really short. There's a really beautiful, very short piece by Marilyn Strathern in the blog site Writers on Writing about just that process, and that how to write interruption into your writing, you have to decompose yourself, and that it's a really self-rending, opening process in which, if you're going to write anything important that has interruption at the heart of it, you have to kind of break yourself open. So I recommend that piece a whole lot.
Okay, yes, thank you. I don't know that. But it relates to one of the things I was going to say is that you learning to work this tension between ethnographer in the flesh and ethnographer in the text is part of learning how to use disconcertment. Disconcertment is, I tell my graduate students that what you're going to look for is disconcertment. So you better learn how to be disconcerted. And what you need to do is sensitize yourself for disconcertment, for interrupters, and learn how to write about it without losing it. It's very difficult. But it's disconcertment, which is that that's what you work as you change yourself from ethnographer in the body to ethnographer in the text. And that ethnographer in the text, I think, as part of everting what's inside that disconcertment, must incorporate the metaphysical movements to show what it is that she's or he is bringing to do that. So that to me is ethnographers in the text can be good faith, can write in good faith, and that is part of what it's about. But decomposing yourself is.
Marisa?
Judy was going to.
Oh, sorry, Judy.
Well, that was so inspiring what Helen just said that I'm not sure I have anything to add, but what actually interests me in this conference and in Helen's work and Anna's wonderful papers that we'll talk about tomorrow is a question of objects. And objects can be so self-evident, and they tend to present themselves to us as self-evident, with primary self-evidency being our own bodies, as in moments of our awareness of them as seeming to be objects. So the interruption that really interests me is interrupting the self-evidence of things. Not worlds, because worlds, as Helen quite wisely pointed out at the beginning, we don't want to totalize worlds, or make them discrete and non-overlapping, et cetera, et cetera. But objects remain a challenge to open them up, and that's why Ngathu's use of eversion of objects, making them historical, making them practical, making them political, in a long, slow process is interests me so much. That's a kind of interruption of an object that you can pick up and gather and put in a dilly bag with a whole lot of others that seem to be just like it. So that's the kind of interruption that I think we could be looking for and making the most of. And by the way, the task of the translator by Benjamin is constantly pointing to these unsmoothnesses, these disconcertments, and I mean that's the whole point of that essay, and it's worth bearing that in mind, or having that in mind.
My question changes as other people ask their questions, but I'll try anyway. I'll ask a very, very reactionary almost question about culture and ontics, okay? That's what about culture and ontics. But before I do that, I want to say that ontics are by definition self-evident, right? Ontics are ontics in the sense that they're embodied in ourselves are by definition self-evident to us. Am I right in thinking that, or is that completely wrong?
They become self-evident. I think it's quite a struggle to make them learn to do ontics. And I think people who struggle to do ethnography through disconcernment are better at doing ontics. So it's very much an acquired capacity doing ontics.
Yes, but I'm thinking not of the ethnographer, but of the people we work with. Okay, let me just ask this very simple question. What do we gain? Where does ontics take us that the old culture world could not take us? Provided, of course, that we're past the 80s and past the discussion of all the bad things that culture can do, yet it can be retained. And with all the awareness and caution that we learned from the discussions about the critique of the culture concept, where then does ontics take us that culture cannot take us?
Yeah, your question reminds me of an article by Judith in his final collection of essays. He begins with thanking Wittgenstein, who brought so many things out from minds and put them in marketplaces, in rendering them in practice. And of course, so he found when he started to do anthropology after the war, that suddenly culture had become something different than it was before, because so many, after Wittgenstein, philosophical investigations, according to him, so much more was out there. And so I think, in a way, ontics is following that, and saying, yes, all those things that are out there. I think to make the separation of ontics and ontological actually gives culture a much more grasp in that world that we now find ourselves in. So I don't think it's an alternative, but I think ontics and ontological politics are both found within culture. So I think it's the sort of naming precision that will come with doing culture in this way that's emerged. So I think it enhances culture, expands, sensitizes.
Kiana, Joe, and Maria.
Okay, we have read your work for a couple of weeks, and we always encountered the idea of good faith. And today you addressed that idea too. And I don't know if it's possible if you can talk about that notion, and if you can tell us a little bit how is, if it is possible even to define what is good faith, because you talk about good faith in regards to numbers, but you talk about good faith in regards to the people that you work with, and you, like in different kind of articles that we have read, good faith appears, but it seems that appears in a different way, and I was wondering if you can define it, or if it is possible even. And a second question is also regarding to good faith, is something that came up also in the seminar. How can we move from good faith to politics, or if it is good faith already doing politics and doing things? And in that sense, we were also thinking together, how is good faith related to other kind of notions that other people have used, like for example, doing well in Anna Marie Mo multiple body, where she's saying that a discussion about ontology is also about doing well. And I was wondering if you're doing good faith is related to that, or like diffraction from Donna Haraway, where also it tells something with ethics. I don't know. Like, can you speak more about good faith and how we can move to good faith to politics?
Yeah. Okay. Good faith, in the way I use it, is something that one can nurture in the text. So the ethnographer in the text is one who can have the quality of good faith. Okay, so it's good faith analysis. It's achieved. And it's achieved by careful writing, slow writing, and it's crafted. So it's, of course, as I go around as an ethnographer in the flesh, trying to remember all the obligations I have here and there, and it's not that sort of good faith that I'm talking about. Good faith is a characteristic of the author in the text. Okay, and it's a good faith very often towards readers, and some making explicit. Okay. So the good faith analysis is very often making the politics evident. Politics and what the choices are here. And that too is something that's done in the text. The craft of writing can never be underestimated, or what's involved in the craft of writing, and what we achieve through writing. And I hope that helps.
I've been trying to count, trying to think of Helen's stories, allegories, and then Anna brought in species, yabbies, like saying, what if we don't think concepts, what if we think percepts? And then Judy brought in, well, what if we don't think those, what if we think objects, key processes? So I'm first wondering if those are three things, and that ontics is maybe, I don't know if that's the right word then to try to put over them. And then I started to think, well, But what if this has to do with the fact that Helen's interest is pedagogy, and Anna's following farming and planting, and Judy's following healing, and that this might have something to do with what the sort of things one wants to think with or write with, if you think about the kind of good faith in the text. If maybe these different, then now here I'm stuck, right? Different things, different percepts, affects, different concepts. You see what I'm saying? I'm trying to catch the recursion before it gets me.
I think it's correct, and I think it's insightful to recognize that pedagogy is at the core of everything I write and everything I say. It's that commitment to rendering other people into a state where they cannot but think and finding tricks to do that. Yes, that's right. And I think it is important to recognize that sort of interest, attention, care, and pedagogy is an acquired taste, and certainly not everybody does their life as a pedagogue, and no, they should. What a terrible world that would be. So thank you for listening. So now that Judith and Anna speak for themselves.
I don't know if you speak. I mean, I don't particularly. I mean, I think the stories, you started with stories, percepts, and objects across the, and I think that's cool. Their functioning is almost like conceptual clock and what we're saying, and they might be quite parallel in their functionality and their pragmatics.
I found what you said very helpful. I mean, it helps me think. In part, I think, I never had a question when I was reading about how these Yoruba children did length really differently, that you were onto an ontic that was really unfamiliar, and that was a fabulous gift to kind of interrupt us and say, wow, how are they doing it? And I think I could have left it at that, with Tim's really helpful idea of how you bring vagueness, how you use vagueness. And the only reason that I got into a snit with it is because we're in the middle of something that's supposed to be the ontological turn. And that means that all of us have to figure out, it's like the math curse, suddenly how we're supposed to be doing ontology all the time. And it's only in that I kind of started wanting to parse things out. I mean, are we always doing ontologies? Are there moments for doing ontologies? Are there, and that's where my confusion kind of lies. Not actually in the instances that you use, which have me completely convinced, but in the question of, how is this the main activity we should be doing at this point, or is it one of many activities? And I don't know. I'm throwing that back out at you guys.
I want to take you back to the good faith. I'm trying to align it with some of the things that you were saying when Marianne was asking you about the ontics, and you say, okay, this is something that is acquired to, in a way, to do ontics. But at the same time, in many of the stories that you tell, and I would say from my own experience also working with the Shiro in Paraguay or the Inu in Labrador, it seems that the ontics for many of these people is, so to speak, they wear it in the sleeve. It's very obvious because, there is no complication in those worlds to see that you are doing ontics, that this is part of the... And I want to connect this with the idea of good faith. because part of good faith, if I follow you properly, has to do also with this making explicit your metaphysical commitments. And that's something that is particularly hard for a very specific ontology, if you will,
Yes.
which is the one we do,
In the
moderns.
Yes.
And in contrast with these other ontologies in which doing ontic is almost an obligation, if you want. But what I want to get at is that good faith, it seems that in our case, it relies too heavily in a kind of liberal subject that we choose to. And I wonder if part of the work of good faith or enhancing good faith is to produce other kind of subject. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm...
Yeah. I think the other kind of subject is the one that I was confronted with on that veranda of the classroom when this teacher enthused with me, this wonderful little book has taught so many children to read. And there I was, in a way, self-congratulating myself that I felt something about being an Australian citizen. You know, this is a personal experience of going to this massacre site and so on. And suddenly that subject, that modern Australian citizen subject, was confronted by this judgmental teacher who did not want this, who wondered, who was worried about this book and my first response was to say, oh, that upset about the book being in the curriculum is of a different sort than the other one. It took me some time to realize, no, the upsets are of the same sort and they are inverting the subject. But just let me just say something about the good faith. We all come from very specific experiences with our work as analytic ethnographic empiricists. Okay, and I'm emerging. I'm growing, if you like, from a situation in which there are, by definition, a set number of YOML plans. There are, in practice, several more. But every Gurutul position also has a planned position. So that, and they are separate conceptual worlds. They have separate languages, and the concepts are owned by clans. And to do a ceremony, you must do a ceremony in good faith. In fact, you must always announce where you're coming from and where you're coming from, how it's connected to various places and so on. So that good faith that I now talk about, that's being clear about metaphysical commitments, originated in that instruction that I received about where you'll do knowledge politics, if you like. And I realised that this insistence on owning the claims on knowledge, you know what that means. So, good faith in that sense relates to both, on ontology and ontics. But it's not separate.
Okay.
So,
Oh, yes?
could I just respond to something that Maria said, because it sure has really gotten going. You said that making metaphysics explicit is hard for modernists, for us, right? And I couldn't agree more. In fact, that hardness is so hard, is physically hard. And it's because we moderns have such vast optimism about the powers of language. We think we can conceptualize anything. We think we can see the unargued foundations of our knowledge. And we should be able to see it and state it. But other non-moderns, other kinds of people who don't pretend to be modern, can only know that they can only wear it on their sleeves. So this, I was just thinking that how does one do ontic work as an ethnographer? How does one try to somehow conceptualize ontologically, right, the mode of being that's in the ruling mode of being in a place? I think one looks for outrage and one looks for jokes. So I thought of an example. At one point, Zizek, reading a play by Shakespeare, said, "This passage in this play proves that Shakespeare read Freud." That's Zizek being outrageous, right? Because he's violating temporal chronology, he's violating cause, he's violating influence, all of which we take for granted and never articulate, right? But it's also a joke, and we laugh because it's bringing the ontic briefly into attention, but it can't stay there very well.